trying to get to the humanity part of that is going to be realizing what the good in of it is. And 2 years in with, OpenAI and ChatGPT, it might be a little hard to figure out what that is quite yet. Like anything new, it seems like you can do everything and nothing all at the same time. What I'd like to see us do is get a little bit more strategic and intentional about it and start really chasing the things that it does best. And maybe, leave the things that it doesn't do best for something else to do. We're not done innovating. There's going to be something beyond this. There's opportunities for that too. But I do find it interesting that for some people, like if you talk to Gen Z, they'll tell you that technology has harmed them. They'll tell you that social media is not their friend. They'll tell you about a mental health challenges to the proportion of an epidemic. And now we've created something that's supposed to boost all of our productivity, making us get through work preferably faster, but we seem to be working just as long but accomplishing more.
Leadership Story Talks, where we discuss the practices that engage, motivate, develop, retain, and attract people to businesses. We'll give you principles and tools based on real-world stories to leverage listening and storytelling to become a better leader and management professional. Leadership Story Talks is produced by Narrative, a company that focuses on personal storytelling for business.
All right. Hello and welcome to Leadership Story Talks. I'm Jerome DeRoy, CEO of Narrative.
And I'm Julienne Ryan, and I'm thrilled to be here today and meeting Laura Miller again.
I know, it's great to see you both. Before we move on to introducing Laura, I want to remind our listeners to subscribe to the podcast Leadership Story Talks, leave a review wherever you find your podcasts, and also check out our YouTube channel where we publish these episodes. You'll find everything you need to know in today's episode's notes as well, in terms of finding out more about our guest today, as well as Narrative. You can also go onto narrative.com/podcast. That's NARATIV.com/podcast to find all of our previous episodes. So without further ado, today our guest is Laura Miller. She's the founder and CEO of NextGen Ethics, where she focuses on advancing ethical AI innovation and public trust. She's also a respected philosophy and ethics instructor at Webster University. Her contributions to tech ethics have earned her recognition from NASA, NIST, and the US State Department, fostering international dialogue. She's also received a Knights of Columbus Award for her humanitarian efforts. In addition, Laura's been honored with Leadership in Education and Technology Awards and a Best of the Nation Business Award. Her ethnographic research was featured in the New York Times Online, Lens Magazine. She's also been featured in magazines like Trusted and AfriBlocks. NextGen Ethics, led by Laura, is participating in the Arch Grants and World Cup 2024 startup competitions, seeking funding for its ethical AI product. Laura presents nationally and internationally on ethical issues of AI and earned her BA and MA in philosophy, focusing on applied ethics from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Laura is also the author of the upcoming book, AI Ethics in Action. And I know there's a personal connection between Julienne and Laura as well. So go ahead.
It's a new but old friendship already. I heard about Laura when I went to attend a conference and speak at it about 2 months ago. And I remember when our mutual colleague, Melissa Drew, our collective colleagues, mentioned there was this ethicist coming. And I'm like, really? And then she showed up and used the most artful way of speaking and humor with insight. And then she kind of scared us a little bit. And then she went back to using humor and insight. And we're curious to learn more about your journey because you're one powerful presence in this world.
Thank you.
Yeah, and welcome.
Thank you. So it's great to be here. I love the idea of narrative. So many times, we all get that dreaded, so tell me something about yourself. We all kind of get the deer in the headlights look instead of tell me the story of how you ended up in front of me. And I think the second one is so much cooler.
Right. Well, thanks for that. Well, on that note, there is a word that I don't think I've ever used as many times in a bio before, which is the word ethics. And I'd love to that seems to really be the through line throughout your entire background, education, career. How did you get into ethics to begin with?
Well, it depends which story you want. If you want the earliest one was, back in my somewhat younger days. I took a philosophy class. It's actually an art major. I was going to be an art teacher for little kids, 6, 7, 8-year-olds, which sounded just grand to me. It still does in many ways. And I took this philosophy class as an elective, and the professor was there. And, he was a wild professor. I mean, I've got stories from that one. But the one that I remember that really sticks with me most often, that I relate to most even today, is all of a sudden he looked at us and he was like, "So that wall right there, think it's real?" We're all like, "Dude, it's a wall," because our very concrete, 19-year-old selves were like, "It's a wall." And then all of a sudden he took off running and smashed himself right into the wall. And then we kind of were like, we all kind of did that kind of face. And we were waiting and we kind of like, there's this awkward silence. And he looked at us and he's like, "Well, stop me." And we're like, "Yeah, dude, it did." And then he goes, "Yeah, but this will be the one that keeps you thinking. Did the wall stop me because I believed it could stop me? Did it stop me because you believed it would stop me and I believed it because you did? Or is it possible that it was only the belief that made the wall stop me?" And he was spot on. That story has stayed with me a few years since then. But it's always been there, where I'm always wondering if the wall or the obstacle I'm facing is the obstacle I think it is, or the obstacle I believe it to be, and which is the truth of the matter. So I have a tendency to now run into a few walls myself, and much to the very similar gasp and awe that follows, me hitting the walls, even if the walls look very different today than the literal classroom wall. Years gone by.
Yeah, yeah.
And
So what
AI
about, go
is
ahead.
amorphous. It's tangible, it's a thing, it's a technology, but it is almost a lot of ways invisible to many of us, the implication. So I think you have a different kind of wall, or many walls right now, to navigate.
Absolutely. And that was one of the things I was going to mention is, because you actually asked me, I got into ethics and I told you how I ran into walls. But ethics does run into walls. Ethics runs into the walls of what we think is good or right or fair or just, or what's reasonable, or how someone should be treated, or what bias looks like, or what does it even mean. And a lot, and often, most importantly, what do people believe it means? What do people believe it should do or not do? How does it appear in our world as a wall? So while it doesn't seem like a direct analogy to ethics, it absolutely is, because an ethics should always run onto people's beliefs, people's ideas of right and wrong, deep-seated, very personal, I earned these beliefs kind of moments. And sometimes you have to find yourself challenging them. And sometimes you find out that what they really need is someone to be in that with them and say, "I see it the way you see it." But making that choice means you have to test the wall yourself, your own bias, your own beliefs, your own belief system. And the first wall you have to knock on is your own. So, that wall thing, man, he was on to something.
And you've really taken it much further, and which takes us into the field of AI, which we've talked a lot about on this podcast. It's obviously everywhere. You look, certainly, and in headlines, etc. Lots of questions around it. How did you sort of connect ethics, or maybe why did you connect ethics to AI? Why does it need
Well, it was
ethics?
it was already on a collision course because of its impact. It can reach further, faster, do things quicker, for good or for not good, faster than anything we've created before. This isn't software that just sits on your computer while you do stuff with it and then you send the file to somebody. This is an actual algorithm that's out in our world now, and multiple of them. If you've been around the AI conversation, ask the number of people who made their own chat GPTs, or GPTs for short.
Mm.
And they're innumerable. The number of people creating on Midjourney, the number of people creating across various channels to make videos, to make images, to make voice, to animate photographs, to bring back the dead in some
Mm.
instances. People have fallen in love with chatbots. People have committed suicide to be one with their bot.
Mm.
The walls seem to be closing in the closer we got to AI. And then we were all vulnerable with COVID, and ChatGPT launched on scene through OpenAI. And then next thing you know, I saw so many more walls. It was like the walls were multiplying. And other ethicists saw it too. I'm not the only one. Might be one of the more vocal ones, but I'm not the only one, because it asks such fundamental questions. We talk about whether or not AI can be like humanity or like a human. Well, that makes you wonder, like, when we say human, what do we mean? When we say, does it think like us? Well, do we really get how we think? Do we understand it? When I talk about AI, I talked about lived experiences. How can you offer advice when you never really have to feel the brunt of the circumstances or the consequences? So it starts really questioning some very fundamental parts of humanity, which are often walls only explored by philosophers. And now suddenly we're having these conversations on LinkedIn, which I've got to tell you was quite the surreal moment. The first time I started stumbling across posts, I'd be like, yeah, but I wonder what being human is. I'm like, whoa. And I'm like, well, you guys are like having the hard conversations, and you didn't have to take a philosophy class to do it. But actually, you're already in one. You just
Mm.
didn't call it that.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
I would say AI found me, but I was already watching the walls. I just recognized that AI was both destructing them and constructing them at the same time.
Mm. It's interesting because I hadn't thought of this before until you brought it up just now. But seeing a conversation on LinkedIn where somebody's asking, I wonder what it means to be human, or yeah, what is it to be human? I'm sure you can ask an AI bot to do that, ChatGPT, right? That's what it's supposed to do, and it'll give you an answer. But it's kind of interesting that humans, because of the existence of AI, are actually asking themselves what it is to be human. So it's kind of like, it's almost, I imagine a world in which we're going to wonder what came first, who had the idea first of asking the question. Did you ask yourself because you thought you were going to ask your AI companion, or was it
Or
you
real
that
world
sort of brought it up?
companion. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind
And
of
the funny thing
interesting.
is, we're the data set.
Right.
So its answer is only as informed on that question as we are.
Hmm.
So it's going to struggle in the same areas that we would normally struggle.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily have the answer because, well, it seems pretty certain that we don't entirely know the answer. So we're
Yeah.
asking questions we don't know the answers to, and it's using all of our information to try to answer it. And even with that information, we can't entirely answer it. So there's
Yeah.
this interesting thing where you can kind of explore yourself through it. But of course, just to be honest and keep the story kind of entertaining, we're asking it to write emails for the most part, or to, better a pitch, or to ask us how to gain clientele, or to look for productivity gains. But if you scratch it and go deeper, it can do far cooler things. That's why technologists are so excited. It can
Mm.
do more than what we're doing with it. But unfortunately, there's a tech skills gap that prevents us from seeing this technology through the ends or through the eyes of a technologist. And because a technologist is so immersed in technology, they can't see what we'll miss. So it only comes out when we start using it for things that make the technologists scratch their heads, or asking it questions where they're like, you know, and we only see the magic from them when they tell us things like, hey, it's better at diagnosing cancer than we are. So there's this great revealing going on, both about society, about the data we've given it, about the tasks we ask it to do, about our blind spots through our fields and our disciplines, and whether or not we can widen those lenses and perspectives to take it in more fully. And for me, that's one of the fun parts, because then you start getting into the nuance. Then you start getting into the weeds. And well, I live in the weeds, it's a permanent condition. But then you really start having the conversations that matter. They all matter. I'd like to be productive too. But at the same time, the deeper stuff is going to color how our perspective changes and how we approach life and how we approach technology and what we call a relationship with technology. Like, what does that even mean? You know, are we going to stay inside connected to boxes, or is it going to cause us to want to unplug and go find the river, the water, the sunset, sunrise, maybe even a good cup of coffee and some friends, or a conference and an amazing connection and a story to go with it?
I was curious because you used a very relatable word and your example of a wall, a wall in a classroom to catch your attention. But could you share with us an example? You said it's building walls and it's also recreating new scenarios. Can you use some examples to show us what kind of walls you've seen as an opportunity and also a challenge?
Yeah, let's look at one that's more everyday. So, because AI gets a little, out there a bit. So let's see if we can take it down to foundational level. So when I went back to school to get my philosophy degrees. I actually had a car accident that knocked me out of my degree program and stopped me from taking philosophy class number 2. Good news, I had plenty. So life is good, and I'd still take more if I could. But when I went back to school, I had students coming up to me asking me, because they knew I was a single mom. I had young ones. I'd gotten divorced after only 7 years. Mr. Perfect was, well, not quite so much for me in that moment as we grew and changed. I think a lot of people run into that. So I was kind of on a quest for self, took myself back to school. Through a comedy of errors, all the art programs and classes I could have taken didn't work. They didn't fit my schedule. They had strict attendance requirements. I was a single mom. I had to make this work. And philosophy classes were in electives. So I started taking philosophy classes. But the students around me knew that I was a single mom and maybe a little bit older than they were. We'll wink on that one. And they started asking me where they could find food on campus and use state benefits. For people unfamiliar, that means SNAP, WIC, or what other people colloquially know as food stamps. Like, hey, psst, do you know where I can, get some food I don't have to pay cash for? So I started asking people, because philosophers like questions. We really do. We're like the quintessential 3-year-olds of life. We not only ask why the sky is blue, but we ask where you can get food. That adventure of asking where we could get food led me to have meetings with the deans of service or dean of students. It gave me a position on Golden Key Honor Society, so I could have access to student government to ask them. I started taking roles on honor societies to try to figure out where food was. And what I found out in the end was you couldn't get food on campus. That most campuses across the United States, this is true, across the United States, sign food provider contracts. I'll shorten the story and make it go quicker. Food provider contracts to provide food on campus. They consider things, or they can consider things like food pantries and public benefits competition. So it's prohibited on campus. So once I found out they weren't going to budge, and I started getting that it's complicated and it's public and private money, it's hard, except we built buildings with them. I contacted the church across the street and I said, hey, would you like to help some, crazy college students across the street? And I said, wrote back on this immediately. What do the crazy college students across the street need? I wrote her back, food. She said, I'm free at 2. I had a meeting. Turns out they had a meeting space they were not using. They were already certified to serve food. They'd already passed the inspection for the city to be able to provide food. And I opened Mosaic Cafe in the basement of the church opposite the main entrance to campus. And I showed them what competition really looked like when you give it away for free. Because I didn't do crazy signups. I didn't make you prove to me that you were hungry. If you walked in and you said, hey, do you have a granola bar? The answer was yes, and we had coffee to go with it. We were only open a year. And then campus changed their policies and their contract on campus. And now they have one of the larger food pantries in my state on campus. You see, walls don't always look like what you think they do. Sometimes walls look like a no. Sometimes walls look like, oh, heck no. Sometimes walls look like I don't think that's possible. And sometimes walls just look like we haven't been able to imagine it a different way. Not that we don't want it to be different, but we can't see it in any other way. The wall just looks like the wall.
Hmm.
But once you start getting more familiar with walls, you start recognizing which kind you're finding. And then once you understand why the wall is there, you know exactly what to pick at in order to test it, challenge it, even change it or pull it down. So that was one example of also a hungry college student, single mom, 5 honor societies, summa cum laude, and I opened a nonprofit to feed the hungry, which happened to be people that were just like me.
Hmm.
They don't have to be these big walls like AI. They can be helping the person next to you. They can be making something possible that wasn't possible before. It's up to you to tackle which walls you find. I
Yeah.
just have to keep finding big ones.
And so in terms of the, one of the things that in preparation for this conversation, we talked a little bit about how should I put this, the lack of input that we're feeling in terms of, adopting a people lens, a human lens for AI. Could you speak a little more to that? And maybe I'm sure you're able to put it better into words than I just did. But do you know what I mean? Like this lack of
Like the human
people's
element of it.
input. Yeah, the human element. Yeah.
Well, and that's what's so wild about it is it's based on our data. It's taken from our conversations. They took Reddit conversations. They took anything that they thought that was legally scrapable and made it the data set and said, you can learn from this. You can learn what it is to be kind of human-like from this, or at least, front us one kind of a thing. And like you mentioned in the beginning, it comes full circle, where it's like, are we learning from it or is it learning from us? Or is it revealing things to us that it's obscured, or is it obscuring more things? So I think that there's this constant, pulling back of the layers only to realize that there's more and that everybody kind of has their own onion with multiple layers. But trying to get to the humanity part of that it's going to be realizing what the good of it is. And 2 years in with, OpenAI and ChatGPT, it might be a little hard to figure out what that is quite yet. Like anything new, it seems like you can do everything and nothing all at the same time. What I'd like to see us do is get a little bit more strategic and intentional about it and start really chasing the things that it does best. And maybe, leave the things that it doesn't do best for something else to do. We're not done innovating. There's going to be something beyond this. There's opportunities for that too. But I do find it interesting that for some people, like if you talk to Gen Z, they'll tell you that technology has harmed them. They'll tell you that social media is not their friend. They'll tell you about a mental health challenges to the portion of an epidemic. And now we've created something that's supposed to boost all of our productivity, making us get through work preferably faster, but we seem to be working just as long but accomplishing more. So I think in order to get to the humanity, we have to start asking kind of what's the point? Where do we want this to go? With the knowledge and understanding that if they're using, and they are, technologists are using, and tech, capital T, is using our data, our information, our photos, our voices, our everything. We do have a say in what we want it to do. You see, that's another proverbial wall, which is they're going to do with my information what they're going to do with it, and I get whatever society we get as a result of it. Well, that's very disempowered. What if now you actually got a say? What if you started curating the stuff that you put online? What if you tried not to engage in so many social media fights so there's less fighting for it to learn from? What if you thought carefully about the photos that you posted? What if you considered carefully whether or not you were going to use an actual photo? Because, well, some of the companies are getting a little bit more lax about using avatars. What if we can do some stuff like that because we're not ready to be commoditized? commoditized in that way, but I don't want to be a walking AI billboard. I don't want everybody to know every part of my life, from when I go to the river to, how often I go to Starbucks or where I get coffee, any of those kinds of things. We could be a lot more intentional about this and maybe kind of take down some of those walls that they feel like they're really infringing on us a great deal. Well, maybe those aren't as solid as they seem either.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to look for those opportunities and things like that. Like I said, you can curate what you put online. You can make choices. I have thought leadership that I've gotten copywritten through the federal government. It's not on my website. I mentioned that I have copyrighted material on my website, but the material itself isn't there. Why? It'll get scooped up into a data set.
Mm-hmm.
Won't be my thought leadership anymore. It'll just be AI stuff. But we do have some choices we can make. I don't think it's fair to say unplug everything. Very few people will be able to live any kind of a modern life and unplug everything. But you can still make thoughtful choices about when and what you do actually plug in for and choose to offer up, to scraping, to being embedded in data sets, to that kind of proliferation. We can step away from those internet fights. We can class up the language a little bit. We can choose to take the higher ground in discussions. How would you act if you knew a 3-year-old was around the corner?
Yeah.
Sometimes it wouldn't look like our social media posts.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because what I'm hearing is that essentially we need to educate ourselves in terms of what parts of ourselves do we want to put out there and make, public or just available, right? And it's interesting because that's, of course, right? Like there's speaking of walls that have gone down, one of the things that social media has done and the internet in general and tech is that a lot of walls have gone down in terms of our perception of what public speech actually means, right? So I think a lot of people will not think for a second in terms of what they're putting onto social media, what kinds of messages, stories they're putting out there, compared to, going down to the local cafe that's got an open mic night. And I think a lot about that. Do I really want to make public something that I've been thinking about? Like, there's a whole process that goes into it because that is clearly a public space where people are actually going to be coming in. I'm going to see them with my own eyes, and then I'm going to, say something, right? But with the internet, there's this illusion, and that perhaps it isn't actually really public. It's not that big a deal. I just have to turn on my phone, film myself. There's nobody else in the room, right? And so I think that's kind of the tension here that I perceive is, and where the education needs to come from, almost like going way back to basics. Like, what do we mean by something that is public or something that's available, right? I think a lot of people don't actually really realize that. So I don't really have a question here. It's more of a comment, but I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, that's why critical thinking is like the top requested skill on like every, job opening, resume, application. But, that's not something you just turn on for work. AI is in your world. That kind of thinking is going to be required, even if you're not at your desk. There's a lot more. And I think that this is there's so much. I love the wall analogy. I have so much fun with it. But, walls can work for you too. You can convince other people walls are real too. You can do that as well. I recommend you only do it for altruistic reasons and, don't do things that. But you can use walls to your benefit. My sister used to use the phrase, use evil for good. So, for instance, I knew somebody who liked to gossip a lot. And breaking bad news might be a little bit rough for me, being an ethicist, but also I try to achieve a lot. You might have noticed from my bio. So if there's bad news I need to share, my sister kind of encouraged me, like, well, talk to the gossipy person and they'll rip the Band-Aid off for you. So it's interesting how that works. I mean, that there's this interesting idea, this critical thinking that we need to ride shotgun on all of this, but also that while we feel like we definitely have been, scraped and used and commoditized, all those great things. And we do have a say in it too. Part of autonomy isn't just that someone is reaching to grab yours. It is also, except in the cases of marginalized communities and persons in those situations, part of it is for the rest of us, is if we give it away, there's going to be a lot more choices layered into this AI-driven world than many people have really realized at this point, from whether you want to engage a bot to whether or not you want to trust its answers, whether or not you want to do your homework with it. Talk to some of my students about that. That's been fun. By the way, it doesn't do philosophy well. Anybody out there in a philosophy class, don't try it. But there's so many more choices to make. That idea of thinking critically, of being an engaged thinker, and recognizing you can't really take the hat off matters, because all of those choices inform what the technology is going to look like in the future. So whether we're running out of data, or where the next data is going to come from, or do we use synthetic data, which is data the AI has produced as a result of other queries that it has been given, and taking its own answers as part of its learning set. That might make you really careful about whether or not you're going to accept an answer or tell it needs to do better. So there's a lot to those interworkings of how our society works, how knowledge is exchanged, who we trust, why we trust them, and whether or not we trust them, as a really funky word in philosophy, an epistemic peer, whether or not we trust it as a knower, like you and me. And usually what that means is we look for somebody on peer with us. They basically know the same things, understand the same things, have had the same exposure. Then you'd expect them to come up with a similar answer. But we're not even asking those questions about AI. Well, I am, but most people aren't really asking those questions about AI and saying, if I look at it as somebody I want to be my peer in knowledge, have they earned the badge? That's a valid question. Julie, you had a question?
Yeah, I was curious, like you bring forth some inspirational thinking and the critical and challenging people. How do people take what you learn and put it into practice, like in a company? Do you have an alter ego that goes in and teaches folks how to build a framework or a structured way of approaching their work, whether they're leaders or at any stage? Are you partnering with other people to teach this concept?
I am partnering with other people to teach this concept. Melissa Giroux is actually our co-conspirator. I'll call her that. I think she'd like that. She's actually working on a project. I don't necessarily want to give away her fun announcements, but what I will say is that there is a lot of incentive to increase education around these, to embrace different ways of thinking about this kind of technology. And I will say that she and I have had conversations about working together towards those ends. Businesses, for the most part, are still trying to wrap their own minds around this. It hasn't quite gotten, although Microsoft is, and starting to ship AI with Microsoft 11 and, Copilot and, having some fun. Businesses are still, we have to remember, businesses are still more kind of in the public than in tech, unless they're a tech business. They have a lot more reservations and a lot more hesitations. They've heard a lot more mistakes. They've heard about a lot more errors. They've heard bad things happening. They've heard of data getting loose. There is a decent amount of anxiety and concern about how all of this is actually supposed to work. And where am I supposed to get the answers to take that anxiety down? Maybe the 500 notches or 50, depending where you're at on a risk scale, down to a more measurable approach. Now, what I've started to do, and I do offer support to small and mid-sized businesses and startups and, all of that kind of stuff. But one of the other things that I'm doing is I'm trying to be more vocal on LinkedIn and finding that middle position, encouraging some of those deeper thoughts, bringing up some of those more critical thinking about the kinds of announcements that we're hearing, or, this went wrong now, what does it mean? and trying to look at it from both sides, because there's a lot of doom and gloom out there. There's even end of the world stuff out there. You can find that happy existential risk stuff, but you can also find the people who just think it's going to be the answer to everything and we should just slap it everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
usually the better place to be is a place where a physician takes some of both of the extremes and tries to find the middle ground.
Yeah.
But what I would say is the vehicles for all of this are just getting turned, not because ethics can't keep up with technology, but because the job of ethics means that you need people that have already, you need to be able to either help people wrap their heads around it, or people who've already started to do that work to advance it, to move it forward. And it's taken some time for people to catch up, to go, oh, I can talk to my computer and it answers me back now. We weren't in that place to suddenly go, I know exactly how I'm going to operationalize that. I know exactly the policies I need. My lawyer's on deck. My CTO is there. I've got strong data, information and resources, and I am ready to go. Oh, and I got the money too. And it came within a hair of when COVID ended.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone was kind of, whoa, this is really cool. But when it came to, now what are we going to do with it? It started to kind of be a little bit spray and pray, or we'll just throw it everywhere and see what lands.
Yeah.
Or a much more protected, I don't really know about this.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I know what this is. I'm not sure. Yeah, you say you can do that, but like, how would I use it to do that? So there's been some catching up on all fronts, on the public, on deployers of this technology, and even on developers understanding where they lost their deployers or the public, and why there seems to be different themes coming up that seem dramatically different. Developers are like, yeah, deployers are like, whoa. And the public is like, it's going to be the end of my world for today.
Mm-hmm.
You got to bring those together.
Yeah.
And figure out how to navigate them.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, and I, I say this often in this podcast. I wish we had more time to kind of dive deeper into this, but that's what that's what you're here for in terms of for people who do want to learn more. We'll be sharing your info widely. But I want to get back to a question that we ask of all of our guests in every episode. So we'd like to ask this to you as well. Could you tell us about an experience that has shaped who you are today? It's something that still influences you, informs you.
When I think of things like that, I tend to think of people more than circumstances, like the colorful characters of life. Julie would be one, you would be another. But before we met, there's some really fun anecdotes. So I have a former grad director, and I remember he walked into class. I guess there was a story with it. He walked into class, and let's just say our writing might not have been up to par. This is philosophy. It's really, has high expectations. Writing is his thing. And I remember him coming in and, you could see frustration. And he's just like, I will fail you all if you cannot write prose. And it was such a candid moment from him. And I knew he wasn't going to fail everybody. But it was like a pin could have dropped, But I really saw him as a person in that moment, and somebody who was frustrated in that moment. And somebody I could really learn good writing from.
Right.
Another one of my professors, she always wore a scarf, and she was an ethicist. And I started teaching, I taught with the textbook that she helped create and edit. And she signed the front of my book, erstwhile student and friend. And I thought, how cool to have a friend like her, And then graduated, I got 2 professors who shall remain nameless to protect their reputation. I might have been a little bit of a student that pushed them as much as they pushed me, or at least I hope I kind of did a little bit, but it felt like I owed them when I finished. And I got 2 of my professors, like their favorite, like, bottle of alcohol. and gave it to them as a graduation gift. Here, I was like, here's for all the drinks you needed while I was your student, kind of thing. You know, because it was just a blast. The first person I worked with in tech, his name's Jalal Patel. He's working on a project called Remasto. And I had such imposter syndrome. And he's a like 5-time startup, like amazing human being. And it was the most normal conversation I ever had with someone where it was a business meeting and they were a hoodie.
Mm.
And I thought, this feels pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all these little moments. So what I guess I would encourage others to do is, if you have those kinds of nuggets, even if you're not exactly sure why the memory of buying alcohol for your professor stands so clearly in your mind, write them down, because there's something to it. There's something about that person that left a mark that years later you don't forget.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember my first philosophy professor's name. He ran into a wall. I was going to call the school and ask them, because now I'm curious. But I can see him so clearly in my mind. And I hope other people have those moments too, and that they don't let them slide. And that maybe if somebody's left a mark like that, I don't know, you randomly show up in their office with a bottle of alcohol, but you at least let them know it's been years and I still think of you.
Mm-hmm.
You've
made an impact. Yeah.
Yeah, and that you mattered, because I think all of us on some level, on some day, need to hear, I'm glad you showed up.
Mm-hmm.
And what I will say, for all the lovely people I've met, from you to Julie to Eric to Jill, they'll know who they are, to John, you'll know who he is, to Julienne and the other John, my husband, my sons, I'm glad you each got a chapter. And I'm willing to give you that chapter, because you get a chapter, not just a note, but I'll give you the chapter, because without them I wouldn't be me. And I think we all need to recognize that the very personal relationships we have outside of the boxes and the AI really have a huge influence in who you are, and should probably continue to do so, even if you are, really zealous and into this technology. It's cool to have somebody to share it with.
Mm-hmm.
So beautiful. And shared with me, I'm sorry, Jerome, doing what we're telling everybody not to do, but the phrase that comes to mind is, all your story ripples. Like, your teacher didn't know till you told them years later that those analogies or those dramatic moments in the class created ripples that came through, and you brought those to your other relationships too, in your other classroom.
Yes, may we all be ripples.
Yeah, for sure.
Goals.
No doubt about it. Thank you so much, Laura. This has been just a very illuminating conversation. So interesting and fascinating, and really appreciate the way you also share your own kind of personal stories with all of this. It really brings it to life, And so I'm curious, what would you say in terms of parting words for our listeners who want to learn more about ethics and AI and your role? I know you've mentioned a few people and projects, but is there something you want to leave people with in particular?
What I would say is, of course, you can always find me on LinkedIn, because I practically live there at this point. I've built a little house. It's very convenient. But also my website is being redesigned. It's nextgenethics.com. I am presently working on, I am developing an app to help Gen Z actually personalize their social media feeds so they can avoid the not good stuff while still being connected to friends and family, and hopefully they get the good stuff from it. So we're looking at personalized content moderation for Gen Z. And those are the two competitions you mentioned, the Arch Grants and the startup. But what I will say is, if you take any part of this interview to heart, man, pack Tylenol. Because those walls, they hit hard, dude. So just like, pack the Tylenol. If Tylenol's not enough, get the Advil. If Advil doesn't work, buy Advil migraine. But whatever it takes, be really sure that you want to let that wall stop you. And to be honest with you, that story about the Tylenol, well, I'll give Jill credit for that, because I told her, I said, sometimes I read philosophy and I feel like I'm running my head into the brick wall, same brick wall over and over again. And she said, get used to it. And I told her I'd buy some Tylenol. So my advice is, if you take some of this story to heart, yeah, keep them in business. Go buy the Tylenol, the Advil, like whatever works. Maybe stay away from aspirin. There's some issues there, but make sure the painkillers, don't overdo it. But you might need some along the way, because you should hit those walls hard enough to be really sure that you're willing to let them stop you. And sometimes it'll even not.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I sense a sponsorship opportunity, perhaps from Tylenol, Advil. We'll see. We'll get them to compete with each other. Well, exactly.
Be an interesting road.
Yes, exactly. Well, what a great way to end, and really, again, appreciate the time you've taken and the stories you've told. Really encourage everyone to go back to the show's notes, where we'll have links to these websites that you mentioned. I also want to remind people of, because it was mentioned here, episode 80 was the episode with Melissa Drew, actually. So these are nice companion episodes, if you will. And yeah, it's really just been great to learn from you, Laura. So thanks so much for being here today. And I'll let our listeners know as well that if you've been inspired by this session, really consider enrolling yourself and or your team in our storytelling programs. These are training programs that focus on finding, crafting, and telling stories around leadership, sales, team building, employee engagement, really bringing in that human element that we've talked a lot about today. And you've heard lots of personal stories. There's a way to learn that, and we've got a methodology. So we're always ready to listen and happy to listen to you. And as always, I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode. And don't forget to subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Go to YouTube as well, where this will be published. This all drives word of mouth. So if you feel like you've learned something from this and you want others to learn, please let them know. And of course, Julienne, I'd be remiss if I wasn't going to thank you as well for being my co-host and introducing me to Laura in the first place. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
The stories they teach us. So thank you, Laura, for showing up with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course, you're welcome. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narrative.com.